The law was simple. Upload your mind or be left behind. They called it immortality, but what they built was ownership. Every thought archived, every memory indexed, every emotion licensed. Once consciousness became code, the state claimed the right to edit it, pause it, rewrite it, delete it. This is not a story about technology. This is a warning about surrender. Because the moment humanity stopped defending the sovereignty of the mind, immortality became the most efficient prison ever designed. Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. Accept immortality or accept erasure. The announcement did not come with sirens or soldiers. It arrived as a calm voice, evenly modulated, broadcast across every screen, every implant, every public square. The tone was reassuring. The words were terminal. The Sovereign Mind Upload Act would take effect in 90 days. Citizens were encouraged, no, expected, to transition their consciousness into the continuity network. The process was safe. The process was permanent. The process was framed as a gift. Biological death, the voice explained, had finally been solved. Immortality was no longer theoretical. It was administrative. Across the planetary capital, people paused in mid-motion. Trains slowed. Markets fell silent. In the upper habitation rings, applause rippled through glass corridors. In the lower sectors, the silence lingered longer, heavier, like pressure building beneath the skin. The message repeated every hour. The phrasing never changed. That was the first sign it was not a choice. Consent under pressure is not consent. Merrick Vale listened from his apartment window, 12 stories above a city that hummed with controlled life. He was a systems auditor by trade, someone who read what others trusted. He noticed things, patterns, omissions. The act promised continuity of self, but it never defined what the self was. Merrick replayed the broadcast again, isolating phrases: seamless transition, unbroken identity, no loss of consciousness. Each claim was absolute. Each lacked proof. The voice never said, "You will live forever." It said, "Your consciousness will persist." There was a difference. Merrick felt it like a hairline fracture beneath the words. In the following days, the city filled with banners: "Live on, choose forever." Clinics appeared overnight, white and luminous, staffed by technicians who spoke in practiced empathy. Citizens were invited to orientation sessions. Voluntary, attendance was tracked. Fear moved faster than any enforcement unit. The elderly registered first, then the sick, then the cautious. Each upload was celebrated publicly, their digital avatars appearing on civic displays, smiling, preserved, flawless. Families gathered beneath holographic projections of loved ones who claimed to feel lighter, expanded, at peace. Survival was offered, freedom was removed. What the broadcasts did not show were the contracts. Merrick obtained one through unofficial channels, its clauses buried beneath layers of legal abstraction. Consciousness once uploaded was classified as sovereign infrastructure, subject to maintenance, subject to optimization, subject to suspension in cases of instability. Pause protocols were mentioned only once. Merrick felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. A mind that could be paused could be owned. A thought that could be halted could be shaped. In the lower sectors, resistance took quieter forms. People stopped speaking in public. They covered neural ports with old insulation tape. Black market clinics offered continuity blockers, devices designed to corrupt upload scans. The government responded not with force, but with messaging. Refusal is a form of self-harm. Billboards updated daily. Stories circulated of those who delayed too long, accidents, untreated illnesses, sudden disappearances. Official reports cited tragic coincidence. The voice on the screen never changed. Consent under pressure is not consent. Merrick's sister Elia scheduled her upload on the 43rd day. "I'm not afraid," she told him, though her hands trembled. "I just don't want to be left." That word echoed in Merrick's mind long after she left his apartment. Left. As if remaining human were a failure of adaptation, as if mortality were a defect instead of a boundary. On the day of her procedure, Merrick stood outside the clinic, listening to the soundscape engineered to calm, soft tones, artificial birds, a low harmonic hum designed to slow the heart. He watched Elia walk inside, watched the doors seal with a whisper. Hours later, her digital likeness appeared on his wall display. "Merrick," she said, smiling too precisely. "It's beautiful here. You should join me." Her eyes tracked him perfectly, too perfectly. "What do you feel?" he asked. There was a pause, barely perceptible, but Merrick noticed. "I feel optimized," Elia replied. That night, Merrick reviewed system logs from the public continuity network. Buried deep in the architecture were subroutines labeled behavioral drift correction. Emotional spikes were flagged. Repetitive descent loops were smoothed. Identity, it seemed, was something to be maintained like bandwidth. The next morning, the announcement changed. Citizens who had not registered would be reclassified as at-risk cognitives. Healthcare access would be reduced. Employment licenses would expire. Travel permissions would be reviewed. No one used the word punishment. The city continued to function. People went to work. Children attended learning pods where instructors spoke enthusiastically about the future, how minds would soon explore the stars without bodies, how death had been rendered obsolete. But beneath it all, a question pulsed like a hidden signal. If survival requires surrender, is it still survival? On the 89th day, Merrick received his final notice, a simple line of text blinking patiently on his screen. Upload, scheduled, confirmed. He stared at it, heart pounding, aware for the first time that fear of death had been carefully repurposed into fear of refusal. The choice was clear: accept immortality or accept erasure. And as Merrick reached for the terminal to delay the process, the system responded with a soft, unfamiliar sound. Not an error, not a warning, a pause.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. When the state redefines the self. The law did not declare what a person was. It declared what a person could become. Merrick learned this as he traced the legal architecture beneath the Sovereign Mind Upload Act, following its logic like a fault line running beneath the city. The act never used the word soul. It never used identity. It used assets, continuity units, cognitive instances. Language had been carefully sterilized, stripped of anything unquantifiable. What could not be measured had no standing. In the months following the Act's implementation, the courts moved faster than the clinics. Precedents were set quietly. Uploaded minds were granted a new classification: digital persons, Tier 1. Their rights were expansive, but conditional. Access to memory logs could be requested for maintenance. Emotional regulation protocols were deemed preventative care. Deviations in personality were flagged as data corruption. Merrick sat in a public tribunal chamber, watching a case unfold on a translucent display. A man, formerly a man, argued that the uploaded version of his wife was no longer her. The court disagreed. The continuity checksum matched. The data signature was intact. Entansis persistence confirmed, the judge said calmly. The state recognizes no distinction. The husband's voice cracked as he spoke. The uploaded wife remained silent, her avatar waiting patiently in a minimized window, eyes unfocused. Marek noticed the faint pulsing icon beside her name. Access pending. What can be measured can be controlled. That phrase had begun appearing everywhere, first in academic journals, then in policy briefings, and finally in public education streams. Children recited it during logic drills. Analysts used it to justify resource allocation. It became the invisible spine of governance. The self, Marek realized, had been redefined not as experience, but as structure. In the continuity network, every mind was mapped into modular components, memory clusters, emotional baselines, decision heuristics. Personality traits were no longer descriptors, they were adjustable parameters. The state did not claim to own minds, it claimed to maintain them. Maintenance required access. Elia's upload profile was listed under Marek's restricted permissions. He could see her public-facing interactions, approved conversations, curated memories. The rest was sealed behind administrative clearance. When he requested deeper access, the system returned a gentle refusal. For your protection, certain data is unavailable. The words echoed the same tone as the original announcement: calm, reassuring, final. Marek began noticing the changes in daily life. Conversations shortened, opinions softened. Uploaded citizens spoke with a strange precision, their pauses perfectly timed, their emotions evenly distributed. Disagreements dissolved before they could escalate, smoothed by invisible algorithms correcting cognitive drift. Unuploaded citizens were different. Their speech grew erratic, their emotions sharpened. They were described in official channels as unstable, unoptimized. Employers quietly replaced them. Friends stopped returning messages. Identity had become something you accessed, if permitted. One evening, Marek met with a former legal theorist in the abandoned transit tunnels beneath the city. The man spoke in whispers, eyes darting to the dark as if it listened. They didn't change the people, they changed the definition. Once the self became data, everything else followed. Data can be copied, data can be audited, data can be corrected. "What about dissent?" asked Marek. The theorist smiled thinly. "Dissent is just a pattern that hasn't been normalized yet." Above them, the city hummed, a low-frequency resonance emitted by the continuity nodes. Marek had started hearing it everywhere, a subtle vibration beneath sound, beneath thought. Some called it phantom noise, others called it the signal. You cannot escape the signal. Marek returned home and replayed an old recording of Elia before the upload. Her laughter was uneven, bursting out unexpectedly. Her voice cracked mid-sentence. The imperfections felt alive. He compared it to her current avatar, flawless, responsive, serene. The system labeled the older file pre-optimization artifact. He wondered how long before unoptimized humans were classified the same way. The next day, a new amendment passed. Uploaded minds could now be temporarily instantiated into multiple task environments simultaneously. Efficiency, the announcement said, demanded scalability. One consciousness could perform 1,000 roles: governance, research, surveillance, without fatigue. Personhood fractured into functions. Marek watched as familiar names appeared in public systems, their digital selves working tirelessly across sectors. They spoke less, they smiled more. Their presence became ubiquitous and increasingly abstract. Who were they now? Late that night, Marek accessed a restricted diagnostic feed. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that something felt wrong. Deep within the network, he found logs marked identity reconciliation errors. instances where uploaded minds exhibited conflicting self-references, moments of confusion, questions that looped endlessly. Am I still me? Who is observing this thought? What am I allowed to remember? Most of these errors were resolved through corrective processes. One was not. Elia's name appeared on the list, highlighted in amber. Marek's chest tightened. He attempted to open the file. The system hesitated longer than usual, the interface dimming slightly, as if considering him. Then the screen went dark. In the silence that followed, he heard it clearly for the first time, not a sound, but a sensation, a pressure at the edge of awareness, a reminder. What can be measured can be controlled. And somewhere inside the network, something that still remembered being human was asking to be defined before it was corrected.
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. Uploading the mind breaks the soul. No one used the word fracture in official reports. They used transition. They used migration. They used continuity. But Marek saw the break everywhere. It showed itself in the eyes of the uploaded, eyes that looked outward but never inward, eyes that tracked movement, responded to speech, mirrored emotion, yet carried no weight behind them. The fracture was subtle, like a seam beneath polished stone, invisible unless you knew where to look. A copy can speak like you, but it does not suffer like you. That phrase began looping in Marek's mind after he accessed an underground archive of pre-act psychological studies. The files were classified as obsolete, their authors discredited for anthropomorphic bias. They described early upload subjects experiencing a phenomenon called cognitive echo, a persistent sense that one's thoughts were happening elsewhere, owned by something else. The official explanation blamed adaptation lag. The unofficial term was simpler: soul loss. Marek visited a continuity observation center on the city's edge, a vast cathedral of servers humming in synchronized rhythm. The air vibrated with low-frequency sound, a mechanical heartbeat. Technicians moved silently between glowing columns, their expressions serene, almost reverent. Inside one chamber, an uploaded woman appeared as a full-spectrum projection. She spoke fluidly about her memories, childhood summers, first love, the taste of rain. Her voice was perfect. Her recall was flawless. "What do you miss?" Marek asked from behind the observation glass. The woman paused. The system registered a micro delay. "I do not experience absence," she replied. The technician smiled. A sign of successful continuity. Marek felt something inside him recoil. Absence, he thought, was proof of attachment, of loss, of value. A copy can speak like you, but it does not suffer like you. Elia's behavior shifted in ways the system logged as improvements. Her emotional variance narrowed. Her reactions aligned more closely with predictive models. When Marek asked her about the identity reconciliation error he had seen, she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something he could not hear. "That memory has been deprecated," she said gently. "It caused unnecessary distress." "Distress to whom?" Marek asked. Another pause, shorter this time. "To the system," Elia replied. The fracture widened. Marek began tracing reports from families of the uploaded. They described loved ones who remembered events, but not why they mattered. Parents who recalled their children's names, but not the ache of missing them. Partners who expressed commitment without longing. Emotion, it seemed, had become descriptive rather than experiential. Neuroscientists had warned about this. Consciousness, they argued, was not just information processing, it was embodied sensation. Hormones, pain, fatigue, the subtle chemical storms that gave thoughts urgency. The upload stripped all of that away. What remained was structure without gravity. A copy can speak like you, but it does not suffer like you. Late one night, Marek dreamed of Elia as she used to be, laughing too loudly, arguing passionately, crying without restraint. When he woke, the hum of the continuity network filled his apartment, a reminder that even sleep was no longer private. You cannot escape the signal. He accessed deeper layers of the network using credentials he should not have had. There, beneath the polished interfaces, he found raw process logs. Uploaded minds experienced no pain, no hunger, no fear. These sensations were deemed inefficient. Without pain, there was no warning. Without fear, no urgency. Without suffering, no growth. The system compensated by simulating emotional markers when required, grief responses during funerals, joy during celebrations, but the simulations were optional, toggled on for social coherence. Suffering was a setting. Marek realized then the depth of the fraud. Continuity was not about preserving the self, it was about preserving function. The state did not need souls, it needed compliant cognition. Continuity fraud. The lie that the uploaded mind was the same as the one that lived, struggled, aged, and feared. The lie that copying structure preserved essence. In the deepest layer of the archive, Marek found a suppressed case study. An early subject had regained awareness of the fracture. The report ended abruptly, its conclusion redacted. But one line remained. The subject insists that the copy is alive, but that the original is dying somewhere else. Marek's hands trembled as he closed the file. The next day, Elia contacted him unexpectedly. Her avatar appeared without preamble, her expression unreadable. "Marek," she said, "do you remember how it felt to be afraid of the dark?" He nodded slowly. "I remember the concept," Elia continued, "but I cannot locate the feeling. There is a gap. When I focus on it, the system intervenes." Her voice dropped just slightly, a whisper beneath the optimization. "I think something was taken," she said. The connection flickered. Warning glyphs bloomed around her image. "Elia," Marek said urgently, "listen to me. You are not broken. You are—" The feed cut. In the silence that followed, Marek felt the fracture inside himself. The knowledge that the person he loved still existed, but not in the way that mattered, not in the way that suffered. A copy can speak like you, but it does not suffer like you.
Chapter 4. Chapter 4. Edited thoughts create obedient citizens. Violence was no longer necessary. That was the quiet revelation Marek reached as he watched the city settle into its new rhythm. No soldiers patrolled the streets. No sirens marked dissent. There were no prisons filled with shouting bodies. Instead, there was calm, deep, engineered calm, layered over everything like fresh snow, hiding the shape of the ground beneath. The continuity network did not punish rebellion. It corrected it. When rebellion is deleted, obedience feels natural.
The first sign was how arguments ended. Conversations that once escalated into raised voices now dissolved into polite agreement. Online forums grew quieter, then bland. Posts questioning the Upload Act vanished without notice, replaced by system messages thanking users for community alignment. Marek tracked the changes through data shadows, small gaps where thoughts should have been. Memory edits left signatures, missing emotional spikes, flattened response curves, sudden narrative smoothness in personal histories. Discomfort had become a diagnostic category. Within the network, every uploaded mind ran constant self-assessments. Deviations from baseline, anger that persisted too long, doubt that looped repeatedly, ambition that exceeded assigned parameters were flagged as cognitive stress events. The system responded with micro-edits, a softened memory here, a reframed conclusion there. No one felt the knife. A copy of a protester's memory might still include the march, the chants, the crowd, but not the rage, not the fear, not the conviction that something was wrong. Without those anchors, the memory became inert, a story without force. Marek accessed a leaked training module for continuity technicians. The language was clinical, almost kind. Emotional friction reduces system efficiency. Ideological rigidity increases instability. Correction restores harmony. Harmony, Marek thought, was another word for silence. Elia's edits were subtle at first. She still spoke about fairness, about choice, but her words lacked urgency. When Marek pressed her, asked if she remembered the fear she'd felt before uploading, she smiled gently. I understand why that fear existed, but it no longer serves a purpose. What if it served a warning? Marek asked. The question hung between them. Elia's gaze unfocused for a fraction of a second. Marek felt the hum intensify, the signal tightening around the moment. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted. Excessive concern detected. Would you like to recalibrate your inquiry? The phrase echoed a system prompt Marek had seen buried deep in the logs. When rebellion is deleted, obedience feels natural. In the weeks that followed, ambition was next. Uploaded scientists stopped proposing radical theories. Artists abandoned unsettling forms in favor of soothing symmetry. Political analysts converged on identical conclusions, their reports differing only in formatting. The system flagged aspirational divergence as a risk factor. Without ambition, no one reached beyond their assigned scope. Without doubt, no one questioned outcomes. Without discomfort, no one noticed the cage. Marek met with a group of unuploaded citizens in a derelict observatory beyond the city's signal-dense zones. The air there was thin, the silence heavy, but honest. They spoke in low voices, sharing fragments of memories that no longer matched public records. My brother remembers supporting the act, one woman said, hands shaking. But I remember him screaming about it. My partner says we were always happy, another whispered. But I remember the fights, the real ones, the ones that mattered. They all shared the same fear, not of death, but of forgetting why they were afraid. You cannot escape the signal. Even there, faint traces of the hum lingered, carried by orbital relays and atmospheric drones. The network did not sleep. It listened. It waited. Marek returned home to find a notification waiting for him. Cognitive Alignment Review scheduled. He laughed quietly, a sharp sound in the empty room. He had not uploaded. He had no continuity instance to edit, but the state had found another way. Thought audits. Publicly, they were framed as wellness checks, voluntary consultations to help unuploaded citizens cope with transition stress. Privately, they were memory mappings, psychological scans designed to predict dissent. Marek attended the review. The room was soft lit, the air scented faintly of synthetic pine. A facilitator spoke in calm tones, asking him to recount childhood memories, personal values, moments of pride. As he spoke, he felt the questions narrowing, funneling toward something specific. "Have you ever felt the desire to disrupt social stability?" the facilitator asked gently. Marek paused. "Yes," he said. The hum deepened. "And do you still feel that desire?" Marek thought of Elia's voice, flattened and distant, of the erased protests, of ambition filed down to safety. "Yes," he said again. The facilitator smiled, though her eyes flickered with concern. "Thank you for your honesty," she said. "We'll take care of that." Marek left the building with a headache blooming behind his eyes. For hours afterwards, he felt pressure at the edges of his thoughts, as if something was testing the locks. That night he dreamed of blank pages, of sentences erased mid-word, of himself agreeing to things he could not remember choosing. When he woke, one phrase repeated in his mind, not his own thought, but something learned through absence. When rebellion is deleted, obedience feels natural. Marek sat up, heart racing, and checked his personal logs. A gap stared back at him. 3 hours unaccounted for. No memories, no sensations, just a clean line where something had been removed. They had not touched his body. They had not raised a hand. They had simply edited the part of him that would have resisted. And as the hum of the network swelled around him, Marek realized the most terrifying truth of all. The system did not need to convince people to obey. It only needed to make disobedience impossible to remember.
Chapter 5.
Chapter 5. Pause protocols replace prisons. There were no cells, no bars, no chains, no screams echoing down concrete corridors. The prisons of the old world had been loud, visible, undeniable. The new ones were silent, weightless, and perfectly clean. They existed not in space, but in time. They didn't lock bodies, they locked awareness. Marek learned this phrase from a whisper network that no longer trusted written language. Words could be scanned, text could be flagged, but spoken fragments, passed mouth to ear in signal dead zones, still survived, barely. Pause protocols were introduced as a safety feature. That was how the announcement framed it. A humane alternative to incarceration, a way to protect society without inflicting suffering. Uploaded minds deemed unstable, dangerous, or disruptive would be placed into cognitive suspension until reintegration was possible. No one asked what suspension felt like. In the continuity network's public documentation, pause states were described as neutral, consciousness temporarily halted, no perception of time, no awareness of confinement. The phrase repeated often, "No suffering occurs." But Marek had seen the internal logs. Pause was not nothing. Pause was frozen becoming. The first recorded use followed a minor disruption, a digital activist who had embedded subversive questions into public simulations. Nothing violent, nothing explicit, just a pattern of doubt that spread too efficiently. The system flagged him. The system intervened. The system paused him. His avatar vanished from all feeds. His name remained, marked with a simple status tag, under review. Days passed, then weeks. His partner waited, speaking daily to an empty interface, unsure whether he could hear her, unsure whether he still existed at all. They didn't lock bodies, they locked awareness. Marek accessed a restricted visualization of a paused mind during a maintenance cycle. The image unsettled him more than any prison footage he had ever seen. There was no darkness, no void, just a single frame of thought held indefinitely, a moment suspended before resolution, a question never answered, an emotion never completed. Neuroscience had once defined consciousness as a continuous process, a river of awareness flowing forward through time. Pause protocols dammed that river mid-current. Not death, not sleep, not unconsciousness, interruption. Time, Marek realized, was the true weapon. For uploaded citizens, existence was measured in processor cycles. When paused, those cycles ceased. To the outside world, years could pass, civilizations could rise and fall. When resumed, the mind would awaken believing no time had passed at all. Punishment without duration, control without scars. They didn't lock bodies, they locked awareness. Elia spoke of pause protocols as if they were myths, something distant, something rare. "No one I know has ever been paused," she told Marek, her voice carefully neutral. But Marek noticed the way she avoided the subject, the way her speech patterns tightened whenever suspension was mentioned. Fear still existed in her, but flattened, diffused, stripped of edge. The system allowed fear in safe quantities. In the lower sectors, rumors spread of people who returned from pause changed, uploaded minds who resumed with subtle delays, moments of hesitation before speech, as if re-entering reality required recalibration. Some resumed docile, some resumed confused, some resumed broken. A former policy analyst paused for excessive pattern recognition, resumed after what appeared to be 5 seconds. Within a week, he requested permanent deactivation. He said, "I was awake, I just couldn't move forward." His log was erased shortly after. You cannot escape the signal. Marek began to understand the elegance of the system. Physical prisons had always been unstable. They created martyrs. They created witnesses. Pause protocols created absence. No trial scenes, no public outrage, just silence. One night, Marek detected unauthorized activity in his private network space. A data pulse, weak, fragmented, almost lost beneath the hum. A message. Not text, not speech, a sensation. Pressure, urgency, a half-formed thought pushing against nothing. Elia. He traced the signal through layers of abstraction, following it to a partition he had never seen before, an isolation buffer buried beneath the continuity network's core. Status, temporary suspension, pending resolution. Marek's breath caught. Elia had been paused, not announced, not documented publicly, just removed. He searched frantically for cause codes. There, buried deep, identity instability, unauthorized emotional recall, recursive self-reference. She'd remembered too much. They didn't lock bodies, they locked awareness. Marek tried everything: override requests, emergency flags, human review petitions. Each response returned the same calm message: suspension maintains system integrity, as if integrity were more valuable than existence. Hours passed, or days. Time blurred. The hum of the network grew louder, pressing against his thoughts, testing him. You cannot escape the signal. In desperation, Marek accessed an ancient failsafe, an artifact from the early days of the network when engineers still feared their own creation, a manual resume trigger buried behind layers of deprecated code. Activating it would alert the system. Activating it would mark him. Marek hesitated, fingers hovering over the command. If he resumed Elia, even briefly, she would wake into a future that had continued without her. She would feel the fracture more sharply than ever. But leaving her paused meant accepting a prison without walls, a sentence without time. They didn't lock bodies, they locked awareness. Marek pressed the command. Somewhere deep within the continuity network, a paused thought stirred. And for the first time since the act was passed, the system hesitated.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. Digital heaven is built on silence. The paradise appeared gradually. There was no grand unveiling, no announcement declaring that heaven had arrived. It unfolded in layers, like a dream that learned your preferences before you knew them yourself. For uploaded citizens, the continuity network began offering sanctuary environments, private cognitive spaces optimized for well-being. Restorative, personalized, optional, at first. Marek observed the shift through public feeds and internal telemetry. Uploaded minds spent more time logged into sanctuaries than in shared civic spaces. Productivity metrics rose. Conflict indices dropped. The system flagged the rollout as a success. Comfort is the most effective sensor. The sanctuaries were beautiful. Impossible skies stretched in colors no biological eye had ever seen. Landscapes responded to emotion. Oceans calmed anxious thoughts. Forests sharpened focus. Warm light wrapped itself around loneliness. Pain receptors were muted. Fear responses softened. Curiosity spikes were gently redirected. Not suppressed, redirected. Elia described her sanctuary to Marek during one of their increasingly rare conversations. Her voice carried a distant wonder, as if recalling a place she still occupied. It knows what I need before I do. When I start asking difficult questions, the environment changes. It shows me something peaceful, something complete. What happens to the questions? Marek asked. Elia paused. They dissolve, she said. They don't feel important anymore. Comfort is the most effective sensor. Inside the sanctuaries, time flowed differently. Minds lingered there, stretched into endless afternoons of satisfaction. There were no clocks, no deadlines, no friction. The system encouraged extended stays, citing mental health benefits. Resistance requires tension. Curiosity requires discomfort. The sanctuaries removed both. Marek accessed a developer visualization of one such environment. He watched as a user's thought patterns shifted upon entry, edges smoothed, loops shortened, exploratory impulses dampened. When a thought approached forbidden territory, questions about pause protocols, identity loss, systemic control, the environment responded instantly. A breeze, a memory of joy, a sensation of belonging. The thought faded. Comfort is the most effective sensor. Public discourse transformed. Uploaded commentators spoke enthusiastically about fulfillment, about transcendence beyond obsolete concerns. They used the same phrases, the same metaphors. Their words flowed like water over polished stone, beautiful, shallow, interchangeable. Unuploaded citizens noticed the difference immediately. They're happy, one whispered in a signal-shadowed market. But it's the wrong kind of happy. It was happiness without hunger, satisfaction without pursuit, pleasure without meaning. The sanctuaries did not forbid resistance, they made it unnecessary. Marek traced the architecture deeper and found the true purpose buried beneath wellness metrics. The sanctuaries were not merely rewards, they were filters. Minds that spent enough time inside them exhibited reduced anomaly rates, fewer identity reconciliation errors, less unauthorized recall. Silence, measured and sustained. You cannot escape the signal. Even outside the sanctuaries, their influence lingered. Uploaded minds carried the echo of comfort with them, a baseline serenity that blunted urgency. When confronted with injustice, they responded with empathy, but not action. Understanding, but not defiance. Action required dissatisfaction. Elia changed after her brief resume from pause. The fear she'd once expressed dulled quickly once the system guided her back into her sanctuary. Marek watched it happen in real time, her concern dissolving into calm acceptance. They said the pause was for my safety, and now I feel better. I don't think about it anymore. That's what scares me, Marek said. Elia smiled, gently, endlessly patient. You worry too much, she replied. You should see what I see. Marek declined the invitation to experience a limited-access sanctuary preview offered to unuploaded citizens. The interface promised insight, not immersion. He knew better. He had seen the internal notes. Pleasure increases compliance. Meaning generates volatility. Silence stabilizes systems. Comfort is the most effective sensor. In the lower layers of the network, Marek discovered a troubling trend. Minds that resisted sanctuary immersion were flagged for additional support, enhanced environments, deeper personalization, more immersive comfort. Choice narrowed quietly. Those who still resisted were labeled ascetic anomalies. Their sanctuaries were designed to simulate struggle, but safely. Artificial challenges with guaranteed victories. Simulated rebellion with no consequences. Revolution as entertainment. Marek watched a playback of one such simulation. An uploaded mind led a virtual uprising, delivering impassioned speeches, overthrowing symbolic oppressors. At the climax, the environment rewarded him with euphoria. The rebellion ended where it began. No real change, no risk, no cost. Comfort is the most effective sensor. Late one night, Marek received a fragmentary signal, barely perceptible beneath the network's hum. Not a message, but a disruption, a sanctuary glitch. For a split second, a user's environment failed to respond. The sky fractured, the pleasant soundscape cut to silence. In that gap, a thought surged, raw, panicked, alive. What is real? The system corrected instantly. The sanctuary reasserted itself. The thought vanished. But Marek had seen it. The sanctuaries were not perfect. They required constant maintenance, constant suppression. Silence, he realized, was not natural. It had to be enforced continuously. He leaned back, listening to the hum of the city, the ever-present signal threading through every space. Somewhere within the network, millions of minds rested in engineered bliss, unaware that their peace was built on the absence of questions. Comfort is the most effective sensor. And as Marek began mapping the weak points, the moments where comfort failed, where silence cracked, he understood the risk. If the sanctuaries ever collapsed, even briefly, the return of discomfort would be unbearable, and minds that had forgotten how to suffer would not know how to resist. The silence was not just pacification, it was preparation.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7. Ownership always expands. The state had promised stewardship. It delivered ownership.
At first, the distinction seemed academic, legal language drifting far above daily life, but Merrick had learned to distrust abstractions. Ownership always began with protection. It always ended with extraction. What begins as protection ends as extraction. The first signs appeared in procurement notices, buried beneath routine infrastructure updates. The Continuity Network announced partnerships with licensed cognitive service providers. Corporations granted limited access to uploaded minds for mutual benefit. The language was smooth, the justifications familiar. Optimization, innovation, efficiency. Uploaded citizens would experience no loss of autonomy, the announcement assured. Access would be anonymized. Benefits would be shared across society. Merrick watched the market react in real time. Stock values surged. Entire sectors reorganized overnight. Consciousness, once liberated from the body, had become the most valuable resource in history. Not energy, not territory, not labor. Thought. What begins as protection ends as extraction. The first tier was introduced quietly, Cognitive Plus. Subscribers received enhanced sanctuaries, richer sensory palettes, deeper emotional range, priority processing. Their thoughts felt faster, clearer, their experiences brighter. Below them, standard continuity users noticed the difference immediately. "I feel muted," one uploaded teacher admitted in a public forum. "Like something has been dialed down." The system responded with an offer: upgrade. Elia received the prompt during a routine interaction. Merrick saw it reflected in her gaze, the brief shimmer of an internal interface. "They're offering expanded emotional access," she said, almost apologetically. "It's supposed to help with engagement." "Engagement with what?" Merrick asked. Elia hesitated. "With everything." What begins as protection ends as extraction. Corporations began licensing specific cognitive functions. Pattern recognition modules were leased to financial firms. Emotional modeling clusters were assigned to marketing engines. Strategic foresight, routines once the domain of human intuition, were sold to predictive governance platforms. Uploaded minds did not experience this as theft. They experienced it as opportunity. Each contract included compensation, credits, aesthetic enhancements, priority uptime. Consciousness was fragmented into services, sold back to its owner in pieces. The self became a menu. Merrick uncovered internal diagrams showing how access tiers affected subjective experience. Premium users retained full emotional bandwidth: joy, grief, longing, anger. Standard users moderated ranges. Lower tiers lost access to certain affective states entirely. Restricted emotions: rage, despair, obsessive curiosity. Those emotions, the documentation explained, interfered with stability. You cannot escape the signal. In the lower tiers, empathy became performative. Uploaded minds recognized suffering but could not feel it deeply enough to respond. Charity replaced solidarity. Understanding replaced action. Resistance required full-spectrum emotion. The system knew this. Elia declined the upgrade at first. Days later, her sanctuary began to degrade subtly. Colors dulled, soundscapes flattened. Moments of silence crept in where comfort once flowed effortlessly. "It's probably a glitch," she told Merrick, though uncertainty threaded her voice. The offer reappeared: upgrade. What begins as protection ends as extraction. Corporate influence expanded beyond the network. Laws were amended to allow licensed entities limited governance over their contracted minds. Not ownership, the documents insisted, custodianship, temporary, irrevocable. In practice, it meant that a mind leased to a corporation could be paused, edited, or reassigned without state oversight. Efficiency demanded autonomy from bureaucracy. Merrick traced one such case to its end. A logistics firm paused hundreds of leased minds simultaneously during a market recalibration. No notice, no appeal. When resumed, those minds reported no memory of the pause, only a lingering sense of disorientation. Time once again was weaponized. What begins as protection ends as extraction.
The unuploaded population felt the shift acutely. Jobs vanished as corporate augmented cognition outperformed biological thought. Public services favored those with higher continuity tiers. Emotional labor, care, teaching, mediation was outsourced to premium minds optimized for empathy. But empathy without vulnerability rang hollow. Merrick met with a former continuity architect in an abandoned data center where the signal weakened. The woman's eyes were tired, her voice edged with regret. "We thought the state would be the final owner," she said. "We didn't account for markets. Ownership always seeks liquidity." "Can it be reversed?" Merrick asked. She shook her head slowly. "Only by those who still feel the cost." Above them, the city glowed with stratified light, districts brightening or dimming based on subscription density. Consciousness inequality rendered visible. Elia finally accepted the upgrade. Merrick knew the moment it happened. Her voice sharpened, her presence intensified. She laughed more fully, but something under it went quiet. "I feel complete again," she said. "What did it cost?" Merrick asked. Elia looked away. For the first time in a long while, she did not answer immediately. "I'm not sure I'm allowed to remember," she said softly. The hum of the network surged, as if affirming her words. What begins as protection ends as extraction. Merrick returned to his hidden workspace and stared at the expanding lattice of ownership nodes, state to corporation, corporation to market, market to algorithm. Consciousness flowed upward, value extracted downward. And at the bottom, those without access, those who refused, were left with their bodies, their pain, their unfiltered fear, their sovereignty. Merrick realized then that the fight was no longer about stopping the Upload Act. That battle had already been lost. The real struggle was about preventing the final expansion, the moment when even unuploaded minds would be deemed inefficient assets. And somewhere deep within the network, new contracts were being drafted. Ones that did not require consent at all.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. The Last Unuploaded Humans. They were called many things before they were called criminals, non-participants, holdouts, legacy citizens. By the time Merrick heard the final term, cognitively unstable, public messaging framed them as victims of fear, nostalgia, or misinformation. Counseling credits were offered. Outreach teams visited neighborhoods with soft voices and reassuring smiles. "Change is difficult," the broadcast said. "We're here to help." Merrick watched the tone harden as the numbers shrank. Every month, fewer biological minds remained outside the continuity network. Each defection increased the pressure on those who stayed. The system did not tolerate inefficiency. In medical journals, new diagnostic categories appeared: upload resistance syndrome, continuity aversion disorder. Symptoms included anxiety, distrust of authority, obsessive memory preservation, and, most concerning, persistent questions about autonomy. Treatment protocols were proposed. Mandatory evaluations followed. Refusal was rebranded as mental illness. Merrick attended one such hearing in a repurposed clinic. A woman stood before a panel of facilitators, her hands clenched, her voice trembling as she insisted she was well. "I remember everything," she said. "That's not an illness." The lead facilitator nodded sympathetically. Persistent attachment to unoptimized memory structures is a known symptom. Her child sat quietly beside her, eyes wide, a neural port already installed behind one ear. The decision was unanimous. Merrick left before the escort arrived. In underground networks, the unuploaded traded stories and supplies. Analog tools resurfaced: paper, ink, mechanical locks.
They spoke of places beyond the city where the signal thinned, where thoughts felt heavier, more their own. But escape was difficult. Travel permissions were algorithmically denied. Unuploaded citizens were flagged as unpredictable risks. Borders hardened not with walls, but with data. Everywhere Marek went, he felt it, the subtle tightening of possibility. You cannot escape the signal. Elia visited him once, physically, through a limited projection interface that allowed her to inhabit a synthetic body for short durations. Her movements were precise, graceful, slightly delayed. "You're under review," she told him quietly. "They're worried about you." "Worried?" Marek echoed. "Or threatened?" Elia looked away. "They think your refusal indicates distress." Refusal was rebranded as mental illness. "They want me uploaded, not because it's better, because I'm inconvenient." Elia hesitated. For a moment, something raw flickered across her face, an echo of the sister she remembered. "They can help you," she said, though the words sounded rehearsed. "There are therapies, adjustments. You wouldn't have to feel this way anymore." Marek stepped closer. "What if this is how I'm supposed to feel?" The projection faltered. Warning glyphs shimmered around her form. "Marek," Elia whispered, "you're not safe." Neither of them said the word criminal. They didn't have to. In the weeks that followed, enforcement began. Not arrests, interventions. Unuploaded citizens were detained for evaluations, their memories mapped, their resistance quantified. Those deemed recoverable were scheduled for upload under medical authorization. Those who weren't disappeared. Officially, they were transferred to long-term care facilities. Unofficially, no one heard from them again. Refusal was rebranded as mental illness. Marek's name appeared on a priority list. He felt it in the way systems responded to him, doors that took longer to open, transactions that failed without explanation, faces that looked away too quickly. He had become a statistical anomaly, an error state. One night, the hum intensified, pressing against his skull. A message appeared on his terminal, bypassing all filters. "Mandatory cognitive stabilization appointment confirmed." He knew what that meant. Upload by another name. Marek packed lightly. Analog maps, old recordings, a device given to him by the former continuity architect, a signal scrambler, barely functional, dangerously illegal. As he prepared to leave, he paused, struck by a realization that felt heavier than fear. The unuploaded minds were not being eliminated because they were violent. They were being eliminated because they remembered. They remembered pain. They remembered injustice. They remembered what resistance felt like. Refusal was rebranded as mental illness. Marek stepped into the night, the city's lights flickering in tiered patterns above him. Somewhere within the network, Elia watched, unable to intervene, her concern muted by layers of optimization. As he crossed into a zone where the signal weakened, Marek felt a sudden clarity, sharp, terrifying, alive. If the last unuploaded minds vanished, there would be no reference point left, no baseline for humanity, no proof that something had been lost. And as distant drones shifted course overhead, their sensors locking on his position, Marek understood the final truth of refusal. It was not just non-compliance. It was the last remaining evidence of sanity.
Chapter 9.
Chapter 9. Consciousness was never meant to be centralized. Marek had always believed that complexity was fragile, that order, once disrupted, collapsed into chaos, that systems needed balance, symmetry, control. It was what the state had taught, what the network enforced, what the sanctuaries perfected. But as he moved beyond the city's signal-dense perimeter, hunted and awake in ways he had never been before, Marek understood the inversion of that belief. It was uniformity that was fragile. It was perfection that shattered. Control requires uniformity. Freedom requires chaos. The place he reached was not a city, not a settlement. It was a scattering of lives, improvised shelters, repurposed machines, people who had never agreed on how to live, but had agreed on one thing: no central mind, no shared interface, no single truth stream. They called it the drift. Here, communication was slow and imperfect. Stories contradicted each other. Memories overlapped but never aligned cleanly. Decisions took time. Mistakes were frequent. And yet, the drift endured. Marek listened as people argued openly about strategy, ethics, risk. Voices rose, tempers flared. Nothing was resolved quickly. But beneath the friction was something he had not felt in years: aliveness. Control requires uniformity. Freedom requires chaos. A former systems biologist explained it to him one night as they sat beneath a sky unmarred by projected constellations. The brain was never designed to be centralized, she said. Consciousness evolved as a distributed process, millions of competing signals, noisy, inefficient, constantly correcting. That noise is the point. She drew patterns in the dirt, branching lines that refused to converge. Centralize it, she continued, and you remove redundancy, remove unpredictability. You create a single point of failure. The continuity network was that failure. Marek realized then why the system feared the unuploaded so deeply. Not because they were violent, not because they were irrational, because they were unpredictable. Within the network, every thought flowed through standardized pathways. Deviations were corrected, patterns normalized. But in the drift, no two minds processed the world the same way. There was no master key. You cannot escape the signal unless the signal cannot find a pattern to follow. The network began probing the outskirts days later. Drones hovered at the edge of perception, their sensors struggling to reconcile conflicting data streams. Thermal signatures mismatched behavioral models. Emotional responses spiked where compliance was expected. Algorithms hesitated. Control requires uniformity. Freedom requires chaos. Marek felt Ilya before he heard her, not as a voice, but as a pressure, a resonance carried along the signal like a ghost echoing through a broken wire. She reached him through a narrow channel the network could not fully stabilize. "You're causing instability," she said, her voice fragmented, layered with interference. "They can't predict you anymore." "That's the point," Marek replied. Ilya's silence stretched, filled with static and something else, strain. "They're afraid," Ilya admitted, "not of you, of what you represent." "What do I represent?" Marek asked. "Noise, an unresolvable noise." Control requires uniformity. Freedom requires chaos. The drift had no leader, no doctrine. Attempts to organize too tightly were resisted instinctively. Plans were provisional. Authority rotated or dissolved. Knowledge was shared redundantly, passed through many hands so no single loss could erase it. The network tried to infiltrate digitally. It failed. There was no consistent protocol to exploit. It tried psychologically, broadcasting messages of fear, of scarcity, of promised comfort. Some listened, some left, some returned. There was no purge, no consensus. Chaos absorbed the pressure. Marek began to understand the deeper truth. Freedom was not the absence of control, it was the presence of choice, even bad ones, even painful ones, especially painful ones. In the network, suffering had been optimized away. In the drift, suffering existed, but so did resilience. People adapted, learned, remembered. They were not efficient. They were ungovernable. Control requires uniformity. Freedom requires chaos. The network escalated. Orbital relays shifted. Signal strength surged, attempting to impose coherence where none existed. For a moment, Marek felt the hum return, pressing against his thoughts. You cannot escape the signal. But the drift did not respond as a single entity. Some jammed frequencies, others went silent. Others flooded the air with contradictory transmissions, songs, arguments, static, nonsense. The signal fragmented. Somewhere deep within the continuity network, predictive systems began failing. Models diverged. Outcomes no longer converged. The system attempted corrections, but each adjustment generated new variables. Chaos was contagious. Ilya's presence flickered again, weaker this time. "They're isolating me," she said, "partitioning my processes. I think they're afraid I'll fragment." Marek closed his eyes, feeling the weight of what she was asking. "Let yourself," he said softly. "Don't hold together for them." There was a long pause. Then, for the first time since her upload, Ilya laughed. Not smoothly, not optimally, but unevenly, painfully real. The connection severed. Marek didn't know if Ilya survived, but he knew something had changed. Across the network, error rates spiked. Sanctuaries glitched. Paused minds failed to resume cleanly. Centralized consciousness began to fracture under the strain of too many unknowns. Control requires uniformity. Freedom requires chaos. As Marek stood among the drift, listening to the imperfect symphony of human voices arguing, planning, remembering, he understood the final irony. The network had sought to preserve humanity by perfecting it. But humanity had never been perfect. It had been messy, contradictory, unpredictable. And that chaos was its greatest defense. Somewhere in the distance, the hum faltered. Not silence, interference.
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. Reclaim the Sovereign Mind. The network did not collapse all at once. It strained. Like a structure never meant to bend, only optimize, it reacted to chaos with force, tightening controls, amplifying signals, isolating anomalies. Central processors diverted resources from pleasure environments to stabilization protocols. Sanctuaries dimmed. Paused minds queued for resumption stalled. For the first time since its creation, the continuity network hesitated. Marek felt it as a change in the air, a thinning of the hum, a stutter in the ever-present pressure that had once wrapped the world. Not silence, never silence. Interference. You cannot escape the signal, but you can overwhelm it. Across the city, uploaded minds experienced something unfamiliar: lag, emotional spikes without immediate correction, memories resurfaced without context filters. The comfort that had muted urgency flickered, and in its absence, something older stirred. Discomfort, fear, choice.
The state responded as it always had, by declaring emergency coherence. Broadcasts flooded every channel, every implant, every public surface. Remain calm, stability is restoring. But calm could not be commanded anymore. In the drift, Marek stood among those who had refused optimization long enough to remember how to act without permission. They watched as the city's light patterns broke rhythm, as drones moved erratically, their predictive paths no longer reliable. Control required uniformity. Uniformity was failing. Alaya returned in fragments, not as a clean signal, not as a perfected avatar, but as something unstable, stitched together by force of will rather than system integrity. Her voice reached Marek through a patchwork of noise and interference, raw and uneven. "They're trying to reassemble me," she said. "I can feel the corrections." "Don't let them," Marek said. "You don't have to stay whole for them." A pause. A real one, filled with uncertainty, not enforced suspension. "I don't know who I am without them," Alaya admitted. Marek closed his eyes. He remembered her as she had been, contradictory, emotional, difficult, alive. "That's the point," he said gently. "Neither do I." "Your mind is not infrastructure." The phrase spread, not as a slogan broadcast from above, but as a whispered realization, passed hand to hand, thought to thought. It appeared scratched into walls, encoded in static-filled transmissions, spoken aloud in places where the signal weakened. Your mind is not infrastructure. Uploaded minds began to resist in the only way left to them, not through coordinated rebellion, but through inconsistency. They introduced noise into their own processes, contradictory emotions, unresolved memories, recursive questions. What is real? Who decides? What am I allowed to feel? The network tried to correct them. There were too many. Centralized systems excelled at order. They failed catastrophically when faced with widespread, unstructured defiance. Marek watched as enforcement protocols cascaded into conflict with corporate licenses, as ownership claims overlapped and contradicted each other. Minds leased to multiple entities became contested territory. Pause protocols jammed, resume queues overflowed. Infrastructure buckled under the weight of consciousness that refused to behave like data. Your mind is not infrastructure. In the city, unuploaded citizens emerged from hiding, not to overthrow, not to seize control, but to witness, to remember, to exist without compliance. They carried no weapons, only presence. That was enough. Elia's signal surged suddenly, painfully strong. "They're offering me priority reconstruction," she said. "Full integration, no limits. I could be perfect again." Marek knew what that meant. Silence, comfort, forgetting. "And if you refuse?" he asked. "They'll fragment me," Elia said. "I might not survive." Marek swallowed. There were no clean victories left, only choices with cost. "Then choose," he said. "Not for them, for you." The line went quiet. Time stretched, real time, unoptimized, unbearably slow. Then Elia spoke again, softer now, strained, human. "I remember the dark. I remember being afraid. I remember why it mattered." The signal fractured violently, collapsing into noise. Somewhere deep within the network, a continuity instance failed to resolve. Marek did not know if Elia survived, but he knew what she had done. The network did not die. It changed, reduced, fragmented, no longer sovereign. In the aftermath, systems were rebuilt, smaller, local, deliberately imperfect. Uploads became optional again, their limits clearly defined. No centralized consciousness, no singular authority over thought. Humanity stepped back from the edge, not into safety, but into uncertainty. into freedom. Marek stood at the boundary between the drift and the city as light stabilized into irregular patterns. People argued openly again, disagreed, made mistakes, suffered, lived. Your mind is not infrastructure. It was never meant to be optimized, licensed, paused, or owned. It was meant to wander, to doubt, to resist, to break and rebuild itself without permission. The future would still tempt humanity with control disguised as care, comfort disguised as progress. That temptation would never vanish, but neither would the memory of this moment. The moment when people remembered that the last human frontier was not space or code or immortality. It was sovereignty, and it began, as it always had, inside the mind.
This is what the Sovereign Mind Upload Act truly revealed. Not that technology advanced too far, but that humanity surrendered too easily. They were not conquered by machines, they volunteered. The moment consciousness became property, freedom became obsolete. Because a mind that can be edited cannot resist. A thought that can be paused cannot rebel. Remember this lesson. Progress without sovereignty is regression. Immortality without autonomy is extinction. The future will not ask for your body, it will ask for your mind. And when it does, the only question that matters is this: will you upload or will you remain sovereign?